got a bunch of folks that join us online and in person. We just want to say welcome. I'm so glad that you're here with us today as we are preparing ourselves for Easter during a season called Lent. And during this time, we are actually preparing by going through the Lord's Prayer pattern that he teaches us in Matthew 6 and also in Luke 11, where he kind of talks about how do we pray. And so today, as you've heard, is the beginning of what is called Holy Week. And this is the time where we are actually reflecting on Jesus, on his journey to the cross. And that's kind of what this week is about. Today is Palm Sunday, so happy Palm Sunday. And as we kind of begin that, and then I want to let you know that on Friday, as Kyle said, we will be having a Good Friday night of worship. It's going to be a time where we are going to read Scripture, we are going to reflect on Jesus' death and on the cross and what that means for us. And so that's going to be all kind of preparation for Easter, where we celebrate the resurrection. And like I said, that's when we're going to be wrapping up our series. So we've been doing this series, 40 Days of Prayer, and we're going to be wrapping it up on Easter Sunday. And so you've heard this already, but I kind of want to maybe put an exclamation point on this, is that for many of you, there's people in your lives that you've been praying for, that you've been getting to know, and you have a heart for them to embrace a relationship with Jesus. And so I want to ask you this question: who's the person closest to you but furthest from God? This could be someone that maybe you've known for years, a family member, a friend from high school or college or middle school that maybe you've been praying for. You've kind of been sharing your faith with them, trying to kind of, hope that they would one day take a step closer to Jesus. Maybe part of their journey is that you would actually invite them to come out to our Easter gathering. Or maybe it's not someone that you've known for a long time. Maybe it's someone who's close to you just from proximity. Maybe someone that you've been going to the gym with, someone who's been cutting your hair, someone who's been, doing your plumbing, whoever it might be, someone that you've been seeing on a regular basis. Maybe God's been putting them on your heart to invite them to come out to our Easter gathering. And just to give you a heads up of what to expect, it's going to be a 60-minute family-friendly service. We're going to do some singing. We're going to share a message of hope. We're going to have a photo booth where you can kind of take pictures with your family as a way to commemorate the day. And so I want to encourage you to make plans next week. I know you're probably making brunch plans and lunch plans, but make sure you make plans to join us to worship. And so, like you've heard, we've got 2 gathering times at 9 and 11, and so we'd love to have you there. Join us. So today, let's kind of jump back into the Lord's Prayer pattern. This is kind of what we've been working through over the past few weeks. And one of the things that we talked about when we first started this series is that when Jesus' disciples came to him and they're like, "Look, Jesus, we don't understand prayer. Can you break it down for us?" And Jesus teaches them this prayer pattern that we can still learn and use today to help us grow in our relationship. And one of the things that we talked about is each of the clauses in the Lord's Prayer, they're kind of like hyperlinks. You guys know how a hyperlink works, right? You click on a hyperlink and it takes you to a bigger theme, whether it's a website or some of those kind of things. And so whenever we kind of reflect on one of the clauses of the Lord's Prayer, it takes us deeper into God's heart for us and his desires for us. In fact, one of the things that you learn when you pray the Lord's Prayer is it covers everything. Anything you'd ever need in prayer, it's all in the Lord's Prayer pattern, where we exalt the greatness of God, that God is great. He's created the world that we live in. We are praying that his kingdom would come and infiltrate our present world. We're asking him to provide for our daily and our regular needs. And last week, Andrew talked about how God forgives our sin, which enables us to have the power to forgive other people when they sin against us. And so today we're going to continue on that journey of looking through each of these clauses of the Lord's Prayer. But one of the things that we've been doing is we've actually been reading the Lord's Prayer out loud together. And I know some of us, we grew up in traditions where that's what we did every single week. We read the Lord's Prayer together. And so during this series, we've been reading the Lord's Prayer. And so let's go ahead and do this together. Ready? On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Great job, guys. You are good readers and prayers. I love it. I love it. Well, listen, today we are going to be looking at the clause, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And if there was never a more timely and relevant clause out of the Lord's Prayer, I don't know what could be. especially when you look at the events of this past week, especially what happened in Nashville. Maybe you guys saw the news that there was a shooting at a elementary school in Nashville. It was a Christian school. A shooter came in and shot up the school, and they killed 6 people, 3 of which were 9-year-olds. And I think many of us, when we heard the news, we were like, this is like unfathomable. This is like the 130th mass shooting that we've had in the United States so far. And wherever you land, I know there's a lot of diversity in views in a room like this or watching online and in your perspective, whether it's on mental health or guns. I think all of us can agree this was awful. This was evil. And maybe when you first heard the news, you were like me, you felt kind of speechless, like, what? I don't even know what to say in the face of all this. How do you respond in the midst of something like this? And this hit home for me because I have a 9-year-old. And so I'm just like, all sorts of emotions that are, I still can't put words to all of them that I'm feeling. But sometimes, I don't know if this ever happens to you when you're kind of processing something, like a lyric from a song will come to mind. And so this song from when I was in middle school came to mind, which was this: there's something wrong with the world today. I don't know what it is. Something's wrong with our eyes. We're seeing things in a different way, and God knows it ain't His. I didn't think Aerosmith would come to my mind when this whole came up, but this whole sentiment of there's something wrong with the world. There's just something that just isn't right, and it just kind of resonated for me. I mean, this lyric resonated to me when I was in middle school in the 90s, and still to this day, it resonates with me whenever I see something going wrong in our world. But even if you go the week before the shooting, there was this tornado that kind of tore through Mississippi. And all these people had died from it. And there was all this destruction. And it's going to take years and years for this community, mostly poor, to ever recover from this. And you see something like this, and you can't help but think, man, that's just evil. That's just awful. And we get this sense that, man, there is something wrong with the world today. There is something that just doesn't add up. There's just something that just seems senseless in the midst of all this. What do we do when we're faced with the senseless? What do we do when things don't add up and we kind of wonder, where is God in this? How does all this connect and come together? And this is where, for me as a follower of Jesus, I have to go to the Bible. Because for me, the Bible makes sense of what is senseless. So I want to invite you, if you have a Bible, turn with me to Ephesians 2. If you don't have a Bible, that's okay. I'll have the scriptures up here, or you can open up your phone. But Ephesians was written by one of the church leaders, a guy named Paul, and Paul is kind of wrestling with some of these things with this church that he's writing this letter to. But he begins by kind of reminding the people he's talking to about where they came from spiritually. What was their life like spiritually before they began to follow Jesus? And he kind of breaks it down this way. He says this, he says, once you were dead because of your disobedience and your many sins. Let's pause for a second here, because there's a lot happening in this one little verse. You see, this is actually a little bit of the setup of Scripture for where we are. This is what the Bible teaches about the nature of humanity, which is this, that we are actually born spiritually dead, spiritually bankrupt. There's a part of us where we really want nothing to do with God or anything spiritual, because that part of us really, it's kind of like, if you think about, just completely disconnected, disarrayed, disordered. And because we don't have a sensitivity to God or His ways, we actually start to walk in a way contrary to His way. We define good and evil on our own terms. We decide it on ourselves. Here's what's good, here's what's evil, and here's the problem. If my tribe and your tribe don't agree what good and evil is, we just go at it. That's kind of the world that Paul's talking about. We live in this world where there's this continual just walking away from God. This thing called sin separates us from God. And he goes on to kind of lay out the situation by saying this. He says, you used to live in sin, just like the rest of the world, obeying the devil, the commander of the powers of the unseen world. Now, I know that for some of you in this room or watching online, as soon as you see the words the devil, you're like, oh man, where are we going with this? Is this going to get weird? Is this going to get kind of spooky? I don't know if I really want to, I'm kind of feeling kind of nervous, maybe freaking out a little bit. But I know also there's some of you that are like, oh my gosh, are we going to talk about the devil? Really, Nathan? The guy from the Mint Mobile commercial, wearing the red paint and the horns and the pitchfork and the tail. Really? This is 2023. We don't need to believe in the devil or demons and all these kind of supernatural things. But this is how Paul describes the devil, not so much this, Ryan Reynolds kind of Mint Mobile form. He says this, he's the spirit at work in the hearts of those who refuse to obey God. Here's what I want to say here. Maybe you're here and you're like super skeptical about this. That's okay. That's okay. Here's what I want to ask. Would you suspend your disbelief for the next 20 to 25 minutes? Would you suspend your disbelief and maybe think, okay, maybe what if there is a personal dimension to the evil that's in the world around us? In fact, here's what's kind of interesting. In the Western world, we are the only culture that does not have a supernatural perspective. Every other culture in the world, all throughout history, has always had a supernatural perspective of how they see the world. Even folks from the two-thirds world, when they come through Western education, they still hold some sort of supernatural view of how the world works. There is an unseen world and a world that we see that kind of works together. So, again, not going to go into all of that, but would you consider suspending your disbelief for a few more minutes? Because here's what Paul says about the rest of it. He says the devil's not the only source of evil we have to deal with. He says this, all of us used to live that way, following the passionate desires and inclinations of our sinful nature. By our very nature, we were subjects to God's anger, just like everyone else. So Paul's teaching here is actually putting him at odds with many of the great thinkers in the ancient Greco-Roman world. These thinkers who were saying things like this, hey, if it feels good, do it. If it feels good, you deserve it. If you desire it, you should acquire it. Which is interesting because it also puts us at odds with many of our thinkers in our world today, right? So much of the messages we get is if it feels good, do it. If it feels good, you deserve it, desire it, acquire it, take it. But Paul is saying there's actually parts of your desires that may actually be working against you and working against the ways of God in the world. So again, Paul describes three kind of enemies or three sources of evil that are in our world to disrupt our peace, to disrupt so much of that's going on. So if you're taking notes, the first source he talks about is the devil, like we're talking about here. Now, Paul isn't the only one who affirms the existence of the devil. So does Jesus. And when we read the teachings of Jesus, here's what we learn about the devil, is that he is an immaterial being who's real, who's intelligent. He has an army around him called demons that exist for really one purpose, which is to destroy society and to destroy you. That's it. If they had a mission statement, it's really simple, it's really clear, to take you out and the world that God has created along with it. And he does this by gaining influence over our lives through lies and deceit. If Satan can get you to believe his lies, he's got you. Now, I know some of you are like, well, Nathan, what about all this stuff about demon possessions and all that other stuff that we see in the New Testament? Listen, this is not a sermon on the devil. There's a lot that I could say, but I'm trying to keep it real focused here. But I will say that I affirm all that stuff that we see. There's a lot of, I know, some abuse and misuse that's there. But man, I've seen some crazy stuff that if you want to have some stories, we can talk about later. But here's what I want to say about this, ultimately about Satan. It's this, is he exists to oppose the forces of God's advance of his kingdom on earth. It's about opposition. So that's the first enemy, the devil. The second is our sinful nature. Kind of like what Paul was saying, we have these two natures. We have this one nature that when we give our lives to Jesus, our spirits come to life. It's a part of us that desires to know God, to grow in our relationship with God, to follow him. But there's still a part of us while we're on earth that is pulling us away from the things of God. It's pulling us towards our lust and towards our gluttony and towards the things that, kind of come easy. And to give you a real quick example, it's like you're trying to get, maybe you're trying to get healthy and you want to, have healthier habits, but that donut looks real good. Right? Like you feel that battle, that tension inside you. That's essentially what it's talking about. You see, when it comes to evil, there is a personal dimension of evil. There's a personal of it where we always want to put ourselves first and our own sinful, broken desires and go after those and make them the priority. There's a personal dimension of evil, but there's also an impersonal or a systemic sense that evil exists as well, and it's what the Bible calls the world. See, the world, the Greek word for world is actually cosmos, which means cosmos. And really, this isn't talking about, rainbows and puppy dogs and trees and all those kind of things. When it talks about the world, it actually is talking about the way human beings order society. Okay? Now, if you believe that we're sinful, broken, finite, fallen human beings, when we get together, what do? We kind of create these societies, we create these cultures, and within these cultures and within these societies, we've embedded our own kind of sinful tendencies. I think, some people would call these things like systemic injustices, things like that. I would just say it's systemic sin. It's principalities, it's powers that have kind of worked their way in our world and our society that actually normalize our disordered desires. They actually normalize the lies that the enemy tries to plant and implant in our world. But also, sin, it's actually impacted the natural order. The reason why there's so much natural disasters and brokenness all around us is because of human sinfulness. Because of our sin, it's kind of had an impact in the world that we live in. So we've got these three enemies, or these three sources of evil that kind of come into our world, and when they interact or when they engage with us, it's what many scholars call spiritual warfare. Now, I know for some of us, as soon as you hear the term spiritual warfare, again, a lot of different perspectives on this. Some of us are like, again, Nathan, I don't really love all this, war metaphor. I kind of have a hard time with it. But, the ancient writers, they didn't really have a problem talking about war, but we'll get to that in a minute. But I know some of us are like, Nathan, is this going to get weird? Is this service going to get weird? Are you going to pull out a sword and start swinging it around, things like that? Not for this service, don't worry. But maybe you've seen online, there's some fringe elements in Christianity that talk about spiritual warfare as this kind of weird, crazy, maybe this bizarre thing. But listen, as a church, we are Christ-centered and Bible-based. So that does mean we are going to talk about spiritual warfare. And so if I could propose to you my definition of spiritual warfare, it's this. Spiritual warfare is the struggle to live faithfully in a faithless world. Nathan, there's nothing here about demons. There's nothing here about the supernatural and things like that. Well, here's why. I think spiritual warfare is so much bigger than that. It's not just about fighting demons. Spiritual warfare is literally living faithfully in a world that is faithless, living along the ways of Jesus in a world that does not want to live along the ways of Jesus. And so it encompasses going to work or school or play, whatever it is you do. When we live faithfully in the face of these things, that's what it means to be in spiritual warfare. Now, I think for many of us, we kind of look, okay, so what does that actually look like? Well, I think for a lot of us, we kind of have, or we've grown up in traditions that maybe have emphasized some parts of spiritual warfare and not others. So if you have the group guide, we're going to draw some pictures. Anybody excited about drawing? No one? No artwork? No artists in there? All right, okay, maybe a couple of you. All right, so here's what I want you to do. If you have your group guide, you can open up your notes. And here's what I want you to do. I would love it if you could go ahead and draw a big circle here. You're going to have 3 drawings at the end of this. And we're going to break stuff too. Oh yeah, it's a good service when you're breaking stuff. Okay. Then you're going to do a second one here, 2 big circles here, and then do an itty bitty one right there. Itty bitty right there. Perfect. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to label this one sinful nature. Okay? Sinful nature, okay? Another word that the Bible uses is the flesh. And I want you to use, for this next circle here, I want you to label this world. Okay? And in this itty-bitty one, go ahead and write the devil. Now, I think some of us have grown up in traditions that really emphasize that your major enemy, it's your sinful nature and the world. So the main battle is I've got to fight my temptations, my sinful inclinations. I have to resist them. I have to resist my lust. I have to resist my gluttony. I have to resist my pride. Or the world. The world out there, all the things that they do, I have to move in the opposite direction. I have to make sure I'm not going to certain places, hanging out with certain people. I've got to resist all those things, right? Maybe you heard the term, don't smoke, drink, or chew, or run with what? Girls who do, right? I always thought that was kind of a sexist statement. I don't know if you felt that way. I feel like that statement itself is kind of sinful. But that was the idea, right? You kind of avoided certain things, you avoided certain people, but there really wasn't much emphasis in the demonic or the devil, that the devil was going to do anything. In fact, we lived kind of normal life. We just said, all right, I just need to have better habits. I need to be a little bit more disciplined. So that was kind of one way that I think maybe some of us have been raised. But maybe some of you're kind of raised in a tradition that was more like this. So go ahead and draw one big circle in the middle, and then draw 2 itty-bitty ones on the side here, okay? So maybe this one we'll call the sinful nature. I'm going to use the term flesh just to write less. Over here is the world. And right here would be the devil. Everything's the devil. It's the devil, Bobby Boucher. That foosball is the devil. But maybe some of you grew up in a tradition where everything was about the devil. Like, the reason why your life was falling apart is because Satan showed up. The reason why your parents got divorced is he was either in your minivan helping them argue. Like, everything was about the devil. I had to burn my Ed Sheeran CD because the devil was in it. Like, all those kind of things. Like that, it almost overemphasized the spiritual dimension, almost to the point where you're literally terrified. Like, you're walking out the door, looking behind your back going, is the devil behind me? Is he trying to get me? And literally, like, you were living in fear that, am I going to get possessed? Am I going to get demonized? Whatever it may be. But there's almost this overemphasis that the devil is going to get you. So maybe some of you kind of grew up in this kind of world. But I want to give you what I would think is a more biblically balanced way to look at this. So we're going to do one more picture here. So go ahead and draw your big circles. 1, 2, and 3. So each one has about the same emphasis and influence, but they all kind of converge right here in the middle. See, it's not one thing or the other. These three things kind of play off one another. The world, our sinful nature, and the devil. They kind of play off one another, they bounce off one another, and they have an influence over one another. But something to keep in mind is oftentimes we think of the devil as being equal to God. He's not. I want to make sure that we understand this. Satan is not at the same level as God. He's already been defeated at the cross. His time is short. He's got a short leash. So even though he's very destructive right now, that time is short. And one day, that's going to come to an end. But we need to understand that these are our enemies, and they are powerful and have powerful influences. But, I love John Mark Comer. He wrote a book called Live No Lies, and he actually sequences what this could look like. So if we could sequence this out, like, how does this actually work? What's the strategy here? Because sometimes when one of the things that Jesus and Paul do, they actually unmask the devil's strategies. And here's kind of the sequence of how it works. You can go to this next slide here. First is deception. The devil will actually try to get you to buy into a lie. If he can get you to believe a lie, then that's really his biggest thing. And so maybe you've had this where you've had a thought kind of grip you and you can't shake it. Maybe it's about yourself. Maybe it's an anxious thought. You're like, but it feels really true. I mean, he is the father of lies. So he gets you with that lie. That's like the hook. And then this lie actually connects with your sinful nature. It actually entices you. You're like, yeah, like that feels so true. That feels so real. There's almost like an element to it that just really kind of resonates and arouses that sinful nature. And then eventually you look at the world around you and it actually affirms the lie. It actually celebrates the lie that you've bought into. And pretty soon you are living that lie out of your life, hook, line, and sinker. You see, this is kind of like a trinity of terror here. These three forces, these three enemies, they can wreak havoc into our lives internally and externally. And we see it wreak havoc in our world all the time. That's why we can't get out of this. We can't defeat these enemies. All we can do is pray, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. This is only something that we can be rescued from God. So that clause, lead us not into temptation, I want to talk a little bit about that one first, because I think this addresses the sources of the evil. When we talk about the first part, which is temptation. Matthew, who wrote that prayer, or who wrote down that prayer, one of Jesus' biographers, he uses a really interesting Greek word when it comes to the word temptation. It's the word parasmon. And what's kind of interesting about this word is it means something different in Greek than it does in English, because the English word temptation means to entice, right? Like, I always think of, when Darth Vader is enticing Luke to come to the dark side, remember that scene? It's like, Luke, come to the dark side, rule together, that kind of thing. And he's kind of enticing him to come over, to cross into the dark side, to live along the ways of the dark side of the Force. That's kind of what we think of the English word temptation. But the Greek word here actually could be better translated as trial or testing. In fact, Jesus' younger brother, James, he writes in his letter, he kind of breaks it down a little bit. He says this, he says, God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. It's the same Greek word. So what's going on here? I know James teaches us later that God never tempts us. But God does test us. So how does all this work together? Well, I think it's helpful to know this. It's this, is that God is a tester. The devil is a tempter. So God is the tester, but the devil is the tempter. Here's how this works, right? You have a situation come into your life, like a trial, a difficult situation that comes. Maybe you lose your job. So you lose your job, and now God is saying, you've lost your job. I want to use this situation to grow your faith. I want to teach you to trust that I will provide your needs, that I'm going to take care of your family. It's not your job, it's not your employer. I'm the one who supplies all of your needs. That's God's test. But the tempter says, doesn't God know you need a job to take care of your family? Doesn't God care about you? That, he'd want to give you meaningful work? Man, you can't really trust God. It's all on you. And as soon as you buy that lie that it's all on you, the tempter's got you. God's trying to test your faith to grow your faith. The tempter's trying to tear your faith down. Or how about this situation? You find out that a friend of yours or a coworker, they've been spreading lies behind your back about you. They've been kind of saying some really terrible things. And so God says, I want you to forgive them. I want you to release them. In fact, I want you to get to the point where you can actually have a conversation with them and maybe confront them and maybe help them figure out why they're upset with you. I want to grow your faith. This is a test. But what does the tempter do? I can't believe that person would say that about you. You know what? You should say stuff about them behind their back. You should go to their supervisor and talk about how they're doing a terrible job in their project. And then pretty soon you can get bitter and hard. See, same situation. But God wants to use that to test your faith and grow your faith. The tempter wants to use it to tear your faith down and break you down. Or how about this situation? Maybe you've had a real bad day at work, and you try to come home and talk to your spouse or your partner about it, and they just kind of blow you off. And so you have a choice. You can say, all right, you know what? I'm going to trust that God's going to do this, and I'm going to journal about this and pray about just kind of the feelings of loneliness and isolation I feel. I'm going to call a friend to ask for prayer. But the tempter says, can't believe that they treated you that way. You know what? You deserve to gratify your own lustful nature. Why don't you go ahead and take out your phone and maybe scroll through, find some images, find some videos, because you deserve it. You're struggling with some anxiety. You need a release. Same situation. There's God's way that wants to test you and strengthen you, and then there's the tempter's way that wants to break you down and pull you away. You see, you've got these two natures that are at war in you if you're a follower of Jesus. And which one of these natures will grow? Which ones will have strength over the other? Whichever one you feed. If you feed the spirit side, your spirit side will grow and you'll be able to resist temptation. But if you continue to feed the temptations, if you continue to feed the sinful nature, it's going to have more and more power, more and more influence. So what are you feeding? Are you feeding the spirit, or are you feeding the sinful nature? Because here's the thing, when you're having this battle, God hasn't left you alone in this. I love this verse that Paul writes. Paul says this, he says, no temptation has seized you except what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. So when the enemy comes and he is like going after your sinful nature, trying to pull you away from God, God is with you in this. And he's going to provide a way out so that you don't have to feed that part of you. You can actually feed the spirit and grow and get stronger in the midst of that. Which is why it's so important to remember that when temptation comes out, I will find a way out. When temptation comes out, I will find a way out. God's not going to leave me stuck in that situation. So that's the first part of it. Lead us not to temptation. The second part is this, is to deliver us from evil. To deliver us from evil here. You know, when you look at that word evil, it actually means evil one. It's actually talking about the enemy. It's actually talking about the devil in this. In fact, if you look at John 8:44, it says this, that he is always talking about the devil. You go to the next slide. He has always hated the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, it is consistent with his character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. You know, when you and I think about the Nashville shooting, and I know many of us, we've thought about the shooter, and I know more information's coming in, but we're kind of wondering, how the heck could a person do that? Plan that? Go into a school and cause so much pain? I mean, you know, there's something wrong in the world. But what could get an individual to that point? Well, they've bought into the lies about themselves, about the world that they're in. The psychologist M. Scott Peck, he became a believer in his 40s. He's a he's written a bunch of books, but when he was an older man, he was kind of looking at the nature of evil and just kind of was like just astounded by it. Because, before he looked at it from a secular perspective, and now he's looking at it from a faith perspective. He's trying to make sense of it. And he came away with two interesting takeaways. The first was is that there are evil people in the world. And some of us are a little bit like, well, yeah, that's not brilliant. Like, we know that. There's evil people in the world. But here's what I thought was interesting. He's like, how do people get that way? Are people born that way? And I know there's all sorts of conversations we can have about that, but here's what he says. He says this, is that people become that way because they believe lies. You believe one lie, you believe another lie, you believe another lie, and it literally changes everything. John Mark Comer, he says this in his book, Live No Lies. He says, when we believe lies and then let those lies into our bodies, tragically, they often become a kind of upside-down shadow of the truth. And as the psychologist David Benner put it, it's not so much that we tell lies as much as we live them. Here's what I think is interesting. When we start absorbing the lies from the enemy, from the world, from our sinful nature, it doesn't feel like a lie anymore. It actually becomes our roadmap for how we live our lives. It becomes the script by which we live and we kind of go through things. It becomes how we interact with the world that we live in. Let me share with you something that God's kind of been doing in my life, kind of a lie that has kind of been coming to the surface. I'm still trying to figure out what to do with it. But one of the lies that I think I've bought into is that at my core, I must be unlovable. The way the lie has worked is this. Somewhere in my life, I bought into this, where it's like, you know what, Nathan? When people first meet you, they like you, but if they really get to know you, like the real you, like, behind, all the stuff, they're not going to like you. And they're going to leave. That's what people do. They leave. So I've got the lie, I bought into it, and so now it affects the way I live. So when I meet people, I'm like, hey, let's get to know each other. I'll let you in, but only this far. Because if I let you in too much, you could hurt me. But I'm going to put this distance in here, and that way, we're cool. We'll be cool. But here's the problem. Oftentimes, what people will say is, well, Nathan, you're a nice guy, but you can kind of come off as inauthentic. You're a nice guy, but you're kind of superficial because I got to keep my distance. You can't get too close. Too close. I don't want to get hurt. I don't want to get hurt. So the very thing that I need, the very thing I crave, which is authentic relationship, I'm pushing away because I bought the lie. And I live that lie out. And here's the problem. So whenever I do get to know people and they're in my life and they end up leaving, they end up moving or going away, it reinforces that lie. So it almost becomes like this self-fulfilling prophecy where I keep you at a distance, you leave because you can't get closer. Well, that's just the way it is. That's how it is. But I'm going to keep living the way I'm living. But here's the problem. The issue isn't with other people. The issue isn't with the people out there. The issue is with me. The battle isn't with other people. It's not with demons. The battle is up here. The battlefield's my mind. And that's where Paul's words are so impactful, where he says this, we are humans, but we don't wage war as humans do. This is where I love what Paul says, that, if you're not a big fan of this war metaphor, I get that. Here's what Paul does. He subverts it. And he says, here's where the real battle is. You're not going to win this battle with guns. You're not going to win it with bombs. You're not going to win it with sharp words. You're going to win it by this. We use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons, to knock down the strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy false arguments. So when we recognize what the lies are, which, by the way, Satan is the father of lies. There's lies that we've bought into that we're not even aware of. We need the Holy Spirit to reveal what those lies are. And when we finally have revelation of what those lies are, we kind of need to bring them up to the light and say, God, is this a thought from you, or is it a thought from the enemy, or is it my sinful nature? What do I need to throw out? And what truth do I need to hold on to? Because somehow we live out these scripts. It's the man who's been berated by his dad when he was a kid, and so now he says, the only way I can be successful is if I succeed at business. That lie has informed how he thinks. It's the teenage girl who's always on Instagram and who's always comparing how she looks with the digital airbrushed images that they see, and it's informing how she feels about her. That's the battle. It's the mom of young kids who's raised by a perfectionist mom that says, man, I have to be perfect to have peace. Everything's got to be perfect or I'm not going to have peace. Those are the lies that inform how we function. And again, the battle's not out there. The battle's up here. That's why Paul says this. He says to capture their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. We got to teach our thoughts to obey Jesus. The sinful thoughts that we bought into by choice. So when I have that choice that lie that at my core I'm unlovable, I have a choice. I can believe what the lie says or what the gospel says. You know what the gospel says? That I'm loved by God. And there's nothing I can do to earn his love, and there's nothing I can do to lose his love. That's the truth. See, with every lie that you have, the gospel truth says, I want to subvert that lie with the truth. That you are loved, you're accepted, and that we can trust in that. We can trust that for me, it's like I know that I'm loved even if I'm an imperfect parent. I know that I'm loved if I make mistakes at work. I know that I'm loved even if I mess up because God has already chosen and said to love me. And so that's why we need to pray, deliver us from the evil one. Deliver us from, we can't do this on our own. We need God to deliver us, to save us when those times of trial come. So this week I did this whole big deep dive into this clause. I kind of went into all the different, I probably spent way more time than I should have. But here's what I thought was interesting. There's actually another way of thinking about this verse, which is that Jesus actually isn't talking about general trials or even general deliverance. He's actually talking about something very specific that's about to happen in the lives of his disciples. He's actually talking about the crucifixion. He's actually talking about the time when his disciples will be tempted in a trial. And they have a choice to choose, will they choose sin or will they choose to be faithful? Where they will actually need to be delivered from the evil one who at this moment was moving towards Jesus. You see, on his way to the cross, Jesus prayed a version of this prayer, deliver us from the evil one. You remember he was in the Garden of Gethsemane and his prayer was this, God, if you can you let this cup pass? Can you let this cup pass from me so I don't have to experience this pain and this suffering? And you remember what God's answer to him was? It was no. God said no to Jesus. So Jesus said, God, not my will, but your will. So Jesus, knowing that there's something wrong and something broken with the world today, he walked up to the edge and he saw the darkness that was there. He saw the devil, he saw the sinful natures of man, and he saw the broken world, and he let those things envelop him and destroy him. And that's where we saw him crucified on the cross. And it's there that we thought everything was over. But it was at that very place where sin, the devil, and the world came together to destroy the Son of God that it actually worked in reverse. That Jesus' death on the cross, his crucifixion, actually worked the power of death backwards. And he brought life, he brought hope, he brought healing. He brought victory over the forces of darkness, over the forces of sin, over the forces of death, and over the forces of devil. We're going to celebrate that next week at Easter. That he overcame all those forces, and he overcame all of those powers. And one of the things that Jesus has given us as his followers to do, to remember that in the midst of the darkness, in the midst of the battle, in the midst of the trial, is we can actually celebrate communion together. Maybe some of you grew up in a tradition where you called it the Eucharist or you called it the Lord's Supper, whatever it may be. In a moment, we're going to celebrate that together. But first, we need to sing. We need to declare that the battle isn't ours. Jesus won the battle for us. We don't have to fight these forces on our own. Jesus has already disarmed them. He has already defeated them, and we need to walk in that victory. Amen, church? We need to claim that victory and live that victory out because he has already paid the penalty for our sin. One of the theories of what Jesus did for the cross is called Christus Victor. It's where Jesus has been victorious over the forces of darkness. And when we celebrate communion, it's remembering that he has won the victory and we can embrace it and we can hold on to it.